in the African continent. We are very, very happy to be here and to host this event with all of you. Today, the topic is a very interesting one. We are going to talk about how to accelerate the access to clean energy in Africa. And our keynote speaker is going to be David Pilling. David is from the Financial Times, is the editor, the Africa editor, and David is also has got a very deep understanding of Asia and South America, as well as also the author of The Growth Delusion. But before starting and go deep into the conversation, just a few words about the Enel Focus On format. It was launched by Enel Group, and it was an idea, a format of events that we are going bringing around all over the world because we want to foster and enable a conversation on the energy transition. So, and when we do this event, there is also a keynote speaker, as we said, and we had many of them. So we had from Chris Anderson to David Rowan, to Brian Solis, to Monica Raya. But of course, the keynote speaker is just one side of this event. The other side of the conversation is made by you all here with us that are contributing with our expertise to the conversation that we are going to have. Audience that is following us through our video live streaming, so all our social media channels, Facebook and Twitter, and of course, the audience that is following us is always and we have usually around 2 million people always following us, and of course they can join the conversation using the hashtag #EnelFocusOn. So, it's time to start. The topic that we are going to discuss today is a key one: how we can accelerate the access to clean energy for the whole African continent. In Europe, the conversation at the moment is focused on how to accelerate the energy transition and also about the renewable and the role of in this. Here in Africa, renewable sources play an even more critical role because they can solve multiple challenges, and definitely the electricity access, decarbonization, which has no boundaries, and the one of economic growth. Clean energy is not just an ethical imperative. Renewable technologies are sustainable in the long run if we see and we look at their cost. And also they enable access to electricity even in rural areas. And they are the only viable solution to the increasing energy demand made on traditional energy generation technologies, which themselves contribute to the problem of climate change and pollution, especially in urban areas. But above all, energy generation from renewable is definitely the only viable way to ensure socio-economic growth without stealing the future to our children. So we are now ready to start, and I will leave the floor to David. So enjoy. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Isabella. Can I just check that this is on? Thank you, Enel, first of all, for giving me the opportunity to talk about this vital debate. Thank you to the millions of people, it's hard to believe, but to the millions of people out there who are following this on live stream. And thank you to the audience and the panelists here in a rainy Addis Abeba today. I'm really going to I'm not an energy expert, so what I want to do is really set a kind of a context in which this discussion can take place. I'm the Africa Financial Times, but as Isabella mentioned, I used to be the Asia editor of the FT. And so some of what I'll be saying, you'll kind of hear a thread through what I'm saying. Some of what I'll be talking about, it comes from lessons that may have been learnt in Asia that may be pertinent to a discussion in Africa. What I want to talk about, and remember there are 54 African countries, and one cannot talk about Africa, the continent, in any kind of truly meaningful sense. But what I want to talk about is the expectations that Africans in those 54 countries have, some of the challenges that presents, and some of the possible solutions. And of course, some of the solutions will be discussed in much greater detail by people who come and talk after me. Let me just start with the basics. The basics are that access to electricity in the African continent is low but rising quite fast. According to World Bank statistics, in 1990, 15% of the population had access to electricity. The same percentage today is 43%. So according to World Bank statistics, 43% have access to electricity. Now that's still pretty low, although there are great variations within Africa. If you go to South Africa, the figure is something like 84% with access to electricity. If you go to a place like Chad or South Sudan, it drops all the way to 9%. But remember, of course, that if we're talking about advanced economies, economies to which every African country and every African can justly aspire, they have 100% access to electricity. And if we think of access to electricity and to energy as something approaching a human right, or indeed a human right, which I guess I would, then you can see what a big gap we have still to make up. Africa is a young continent on the move. The median age in sub-Saharan Africa is 19. 19. By comparison, the median age in Europe is 40. The median age in Japan is 47. I think we were saying that it was in Italy it's about 46. I would need to check that number, but something of that order. Now that's very important. If you look at the discussion in Europe, to some extent in North America, mature economies, the discussion around energy is very much about sustainable growth, about decarbonization, about, even on the fringes of that debate, about degrowth, which is becoming an important theme. And that's really driven by concerns about the environment, concerns about climate change, reports that came out recently, for example, about a collapse in biodiversity. It's important to realize, I think, that the conversation is very different in Africa. This guy is Bobby Wine. Some of you will know him. He's a rap singer in Uganda. He's a potential presidential candidate, although he's 33, I think, in his early 30s, and therefore old by African standards. He has come to kind of speak for African youth. Now, he won't be talking about decarbonization very much. He'll be talking about aspirations for democracy, aspirations for services to be delivered, aspirations for growth. And that's important, I think, to realize. And it's completely understandable. If you think about the GDP per capita in nominal terms in Africa, these are very, very rough numbers, roughly about $1,500, maybe $2,000. And if you look at those numbers, this is nominal GDP. If you look at those numbers in what economists call purchasing power parity terms, PPP, which adjust for local prices, you might find that that rises somewhat, and that is a sort of a low estimate. But let's look at the GDP per capita in the United States, $62,000. And the United States is not the richest per capita country in the world by any means. In other words, there is an enormous gap. Now, if you believe in the theory of convergence, then you will believe that that gap will start to narrow. Without going into too much detail, the theory of convergence says that, if you go back to agricultural times, pre-industrial times, economies around the world, in such that there were economies, had roughly the same kind of level of income all around the world. Then you had the Industrial Revolution, and you had countries like the UK, then Europe following them, the United States, Australia, and so on, really kind of peel off and become much more productive, much more efficient in their production, and become many multiple times richer in per capita terms, 30 or 40 times at the peak, which was in about 1950. Then convergence begins. Convergence because the lessons of industrialization can be learned, and technology can spread around the world, and you get catch-up, which is another way of saying convergence. You get Japan and South Korea, Taiwan, now of course China, following it India, beginning to close the gap with advanced nations. And we can expect, we can certainly hope, but we can expect African nations to begin to do the same. So in other words, again, that's another way of saying, there's a lot of room for growth. Of course, what kind of growth is a topic for discussion today. Let's look at that another way. Let's look at that in terms of access to electricity or use of energy. Night lights taken by satellite can be a very useful proxy for GDP for levels of income. This is a map of, as you see, of Europe and Africa. Now you can see Europe ablaze with lights at night, which is a sign that Europe is a rich, mature continent. And you'll see that parts of Africa are also ablaze, but we can kind of look at those parts and almost name them. You can see South Africa, you can see Luanda in Angola, you've got the coast, there's coastal cities, and there's a big area around Lagos in West Africa. On the east coast you can see Nairobi and so on. But there are vast areas without access to electricity, as shown by night lights. Let's look at that in numbers. This is some numbers that I found. Electrical energy use per capita, measured in kilowatt hours. In South Africa, 3,900. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country, remember, with the Congo River, huge source of potential energy, 114. In Ethiopia, the number that I read, it seems too low to me, but 65. That compares with 12,000 in the United States. Now, if that number is anything like true, that means that every American uses 185 times more energy than every Ethiopian. And that is really a number, I think, to kind of stop and think about, because it ought to give us pause for thought, and it ought to make us think, if we're sort of saying, Africans need to sacrifice growth, or they need to sacrifice the use of electricity or use of energy because the world can no longer take it, the response to that the response to that is really quite obvious. The response is, you have been the ones who have polluted. You have been the ones who have benefited from all that use of energy. You've been the ones that have grown. Now it's our turn. Now I happened to be in Angola the week before last at a big oil and gas conference, Angola having huge deposits of oil and gas. This was the petroleum minister of Equatorial Guinea speaking. And he said, people who say you should go into renewable energy or grow tomatoes, I'm simply not interested. Oil and gas is my resource. I'm going to use it. We are not the ones who pollute. It is the consumers who are responsible for that. And where are those consumers? Those consumers, as we saw in the previous map, are not by and large in Africa. By and large, they're in rich Western countries, increasingly in Asian countries. There is no way, either in practical terms or in moral terms, that you can ask African people. That is not a solution. That is, in a sense, the scale of the problem. But actually, I've only told you 1/4 of the scale of. So why? Well, now we move on to demographics. So this is, I think, a rather brilliant number invented by a guy called Hans Rosling, the late great Swedish health expert and data analyst. He called this the pin code of the world. This is the pin code of the world in very rough numbers that we live in today. So the pin code of the world, and it's almost worth remembering, I think, is 1114. What does that mean? That means that 1 billion people live in the Americas, 1 billion people live in Europe, 1 billion people live in Africa, and 4 billion people live in Asia, obviously in very round numbers. Let's fast forward to 2050, if we can. Yeah. So in 2050, this is the pin code of the world, 1125. So what has happened? The Americas have stopped growing. They've already stopped growing. Europe stopped growing. Africa is still growing very fast. It doubles to 2 billion by 2050. That is pretty much baked in. Asia adds 1 billion, and then very interestingly stops. As far as we know, and of course there's an element of futurology here, although some of these numbers are very predictable because of the way that demographics work, certainly until 2050. Asia then stops. If you go forward to 2100, and then, of course, we are in the realms of futurology here. But on current trends, this is what you would get. 1, 1, 4, 5. That's 1 billion in the Americas, the same as today. 1 billion in Europe, the same as today. 4 billion in Africa, 4 times the population of today. And 5 billion in Asia, because Asia stopped in 2050. So all the demographic action of the planet is happening right here on this continent. So if there are 1 billion people that have every right and every expectation to high standards of living, and therefore access to energy and electricity, there'll be 4 times, as far as we can tell, 4 times that many, in the foreseeable future. Something else is going on that we need to think about, and that is the growth of cities, and specifically the growth of cities in Africa. Now here I think there is the germ of good news. Now, urbanization is not always pretty. You only need to go back to the Industrial Revolution in Britain to know that. But it's happening, and it can bring solutions and benefits as well as problems, as I'm about to kind of hint at. So at the moment, about 40% of Africans live in cities. That's below the global average, which is about 51%, I think, last time I looked. We've crossed the 50% threshold. Until fairly recently, China looked pretty much as Africa looked now, but of course it's urbanized very quickly. So now more than half the world's population live in cities, and Africa is going in the same direction. We've seen megacities like Kinshasa, Lagos, but we've also seen that many smaller cities, some of which aren't even that well known, are growing exceedingly fast. And by some measures, the top 10 fastest growing cities in the world are all African. And these are, again, World Bank numbers, that from 2018 to 2035, 21 of the top 30 of the world's fastest growing cities will be in Africa. That means that the urban population, today about 470 million on the continent, will more than double to 1 billion. Again, I think this is the potential advantage, because cities are the best that humanity has come up with for providing higher living standards, for innovating, for sharing ideas, with as low a carbon footprint as possible. Because high density, again, it's just a numbers game. It is far easier to bring electricity. It is far easier to bring water. It is far easier to take away sewage. It is far easier to bring internet connection to people living in high density urban areas. If you look at Hong Kong, if you look at many of the new cities in China, you know, they're sort of skyscraper cities, or they certainly tend in that direction. Public transport, of course, is another enormous benefit of urban environments, because instead of having to travel enormous distances and expend huge amounts of energy, petrol, diesel, or whatever, maybe battery-powered cars, eventually trucks, one can move around in public transport. Again, look at some of the big cities in China with very, very fast developed metro systems. There's 20 cities in China with huge metro systems. Millions of people, tens of millions of people around to places of work, to share ideas, to help their economies grow and to improve their standards of life with minimal environmental impact. Now, you don't need me to tell you that a lot of African cities don't look like this. If I go back to the previous slide, this is what a lot of African cities look like. A lot of the growth that's happening is not in the downtown areas, it's in the peri-urban areas. I was in Bamako in Mali last year, and by some reckoning, Bamako, not a particularly well-known city, is the fastest growing city in the world. Statisticians would always dispute data, but and I went to Yirimagio, which is a peri-urban area, which was the fastest growing part of Bamako. So in a sense, I was in the fastest growing part of the world. What did it look like? It looked a lot like a village. You know, there weren't many services, there weren't many roads, it was very haphazard, there was very little sign of planning. I spoke to a lot of women who said that the main headache for them was fetching water. They had to get up early in the morning, they had to walk, and they had to bring back water. That sounds like life in an African village. And in a sense, that's the problem of the way that a lot of African cities are developing. But it's also an opportunity, because if cities can learn to plan, if cities can be empowered, then there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. And planning, I think, is another of my messages. The free market, of course, has its place, but first of all, the market needs regulating. But the role of planning, as we saw in many of the Asian economies that took off, South Korea had a plan, Taiwan had a plan. Let's just think of a couple of examples of planning in the African continent. There's one here in Ethiopia, the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, an enormous project to build a dam. Now, dams are of course controversial. A dam of that size is bound to have environmental side effects. There are also big diplomatic side effects. We've seen Ethiopia arguing with Egypt about what that dam will do to the level of the Nile, and whether, in a sense, Ethiopia is stealing water that rightfully belongs to Egypt. Now, these are big diplomatic tussles. Put these things aside, though, and what you have, and it's hard to put them aside, but put them aside, what you have is a plan to produce enormous amounts of electricity sustainably, that can supply not only much of Ethiopia's needs, but can actually provide a surplus to be sold to neighboring countries. Now, that is very unusual in Africa. I'm not saying it's a perfect plan. I'm not saying it's without its faults or controversies. But there is a plan. Another plan, which may sound slightly different and not really kind of linked to the discussion of energy so much, is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is being discussed now, which is really moving rather swiftly. And despite the fact that Nigeria hasn't yet signed up, there are many other countries that are forging ahead. And what does this mean? Well, it means that some of the issues that need to be discussed on a continental level can be discussed on a continental level. It means economies of scale. It means that countries will be able to specialize. On the energy front, it ought presumably to make it easier for countries to trade energy, to link up grids. Many problems will be solved and tackled at a local level. Many will be tackled, as I said, at a city level. Some, of course, will be tackled at a nation-state level. But increasingly, some problems can be addressed, tackled, thought about at a regional level and even at a continental level. Let's go on to technology and this idea of leapfrogging. Now, before we jump straight into the wonders of technology and leapfrogging, I think we need to acknowledge one thing, and that is that almost all the countries that have got rich have gone through the following pattern. They've basically become kind of industrial powers. They've been highly pollutant. They've got wealthier, and then they've thought, let's do something about that pollution. And then they've kind of cleaned it up. They've often cleaned it up by exporting that pollution to somewhere else. So when Europe cleaned up its pollution, it basically sent it all to China. Now China is worried about its pollution. Presumably one of the things, it's already sending it to the west of China. Presumably eventually it will try and send some of that abroad. So we can't be overly moralistic about this, I don't think. We must acknowledge that Western economies got rich by, doing things that we no longer approve of. Now, that does not at all follow that therefore African economies need to do the same. They may, and we ought to expect them to do some of it. But there are obviously technological solutions. There is knowledge that was not available 100 years ago, even 20 years ago, that could now be employed. And if African governments African businesses, African individuals can be convinced that there are technological solutions, then of course they can be adopted. Now we've seen the power of leapfrogging. I think we've also seen the limits, but we have seen the power of leapfrogging in the telecom system. This is, you know, a well-worn sort of cliche, but it bears repeating, I think. You know, Africa has in a sense leapfrogged the whole fixed line development. So in Nigeria, 10 or 15 years ago, you had 100,000 functioning fixed line telephones. You know, now you have, I don't know what the latest number is, 80 million, 100 million mobile phones. Increasingly, we see smartphones made not only in China, but even here in Ethiopia. The price plummeting and smartphone penetration, let alone feature phone penetration, really sort of increasing very rapidly. Now, clearly that is both an example of what can happen, of how technology can leap certain stages of development, and it's also an enabler in its own right. So in the case of mobile phone technology, not only are people able to move money around, but for example, there are innovative pricing mechanisms where individual solar panels can be installed at village level and people can pay for those down their phone, etc. So technology does absolutely open up new vistas which must be explored, and African governments can be extraordinarily smart about this, and it may be that they can have their cake and eat it too. They may be able to get fast, rapid growth of the sort we've seen in many African economies. And remember, 6 of the top 10 fastest growing economies last year and the year before were African. If you discount the big oil producers, this is a continent with some of the fastest growing economies in the world. Maybe they can have their cake and eat it too. They can grow fast through the use of solar, the use of wind power, off-grid power, smart grids, etc. I think there's one important caveat that perhaps we can discuss at the panel, you know, during the panel discussion, and that is that given all the numbers that I gave you earlier about African levels of GDP, about expectations and aspirations of a young population that has seen what a good standard of living looks like and wants it. Given all of that, we know that that these economies are going to want to grow and grow fast, because that's the only way that you know, Asia showed that you need to grow for 20 or 30 years at 10% a year. And given all that, industrialization, even in this post-manufacturing, post-industrial age, industrialization will need to play a part. So access to electricity does not only mean access to, you know, a reading lamp, access to a washing machine and a microwave, access to somewhere to recharge your mobile phone. It also means access to power that can drive forward living standards across this continent, so that Africans, 1 billion Africans today, and more in the future, can have the living standards to which they rightly aspire and deserve. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for your inspiring talk. Definitely, the African continent is full of potential, and that's really, really amazing. And for this reason also is attracting many companies, and that's why I'm particularly happy and pleased to introduce you to the next guest, who is Antonello Camisecra. Antonello is the CEO of Enel Green Power, one of the biggest players in the renewable energy industries. And also, Antonello is the president of the Rest for Africa Foundation, that is a leading organization aiming to create an enabling environment for renewable energy investments in the sub-Saharan African countries. He is also a veteran of our Enel Focus On event, so I'm sure that his perspective will be a key, and it will definitely be a key contribution to our discussion today. So, Antonello,
thank you,
the floor is all yours.
Can
I don't know, the clicker, yes, is there?
Thank you.
Is the mic working?
good afternoon, and thank you, Isabella, for inviting me again to the Focus On format. That means that I have not been too bad in the past 2 or 3 of them. But I want to improve, so I would like to entertain you on a very important topic, accelerating access to clean energy, in particular in Africa. First of all, I will start by saying something. I completely agree with what the Minister of Oil said about renewable energy in Equatorial Guinea. He is completely right. It's not the duty of any energy minister. It's the choice of consumer that will switch massively in the planet from fossil fuels to renewable sources. So the Minister of Oil better watch out what is happening in Europe, United States, Latin America, and lately, but inevitably in Africa will happen. So it will be consumers that will decide to live a safer, easier, more acceptable and sustainable life. So they will switch to a more sustainable lifestyle, which will include, as a fundamental part of it, the access to electricity through renewable sources. So we will check this out in the next years, if I'm right or the Minister of Oil is right. So do we have a presentation here? We'll start by showing the, let's say, economical growth in real terms of Africa in the last maybe 20 years. It has been quite an impressive growth. It's at continental level. There have been many differences between countries in Africa. Africa, basically, we know that does not exist. It's the sum of 50 continents in terms of macroeconomical conditions. But as we look at the whole continent, there was a quite sustained growth, and we had some roller coaster during the economical crisis, which shows one thing that's very important. The economy of Africa is very fragile and pretty much exposed to 2 things: the global economy and the climate change effect, as we'll see in a while. So why this is important when we talk about electricity and access to electricity is because it has been widely recognized that basically one of the most the adversely influencing factor to the sustained, stable growth of economy, which in turn means also more prosperous lives and wealthier and healthier lifestyles in all Africa, is the lack of energy. Lack of energy, which means 2 things, basically. The access to electricity, the negation to access to electricity, it's a negation of a human right, as we used to say. And on the other side, the lack of abundant source of electricity, which will make possible for African economy to become stronger and more prosperous, not being condemned to a sort of energy frugality, which is what many technological solutions will probably inevitably imply. So if this is true, the situation that we all know in Africa is that the access to high has been mentioned by David, that about 70 nations sub-Saharan Africa is still without access to electricity. These the picture of Europe well illuminated overnight and Africa in the darkness is absolutely symbolic and much more, let's say, represent the situation much better than many words. But so overall, what does it mean? 70%, 40%? It didn't mean 600 million people. So even if from one side we can say that in the past 10 years there has been very significant progresses in this to solve this problem, the reality is that combined with the demographic growth, the number of people still without access to electricity is increasing. And even more scary is the consideration that by 2030, this number, according to IEA, will further grow to 630 million. So we are not solving the issue. It's a fact. The issue is not being solved because there will be more people without access to electricity than we have today. Where is this problem? Is it in the rural area, in the far away from? No, because as also David mentioned, there is a very strong urbanization phenomenon, probably the strongest at the global level. If we combine the rate of population growth with the urbanization trend, we will have that 50% of people will be living in peri-urban area in Africa. By 2030, this number will become 60% of the entire Africa population. And what does it mean peri-urban area? It will mean that what you see in the picture now, we just put once, but there has been a brilliant photographer that with the drones, Johnny Miller, we have, actually I want to thank him because his pictures are fantastic because they represent with the simple, quick view, the dramatic problem that Africa is living. There is a very fine line between, let's say, prosperity, modern lifestyles, or decent quality of living, and the darkness, the lack of fresh water, the lack of sewages, and so the lack of modernity. It's not villages in remote rural areas compared to, the luring cities of Africa. It's exactly in the same place. So that's why we believe that renewables is the solution. We strongly believe renewables is the solution. It's not only because there will be a leapfrog from conventional fossil fuels to new modern technology, but it's mainly for fundamental reasons that I would like to bring to the discussion today. First of all, renewables are easy to do. Theoretically, they are easy to do. When they will see that sometimes they become harder, but not for technological reasons. So normally to build a PV plant or a wind plant, grid-connected utility scales, we're talking of tens or hundreds of megawatts, we need between 8 and 12 months. From 8 to 12 months to bring a power plant up on grid. Okay? Well, if you look what it's needed for a coal plant, you need between 40 to 60 months. Second very important point. In Africa, there is an abundance, absolute abundance of renewable resources of all sorts. We have geothermal, we have hydro, we have wind, and we have sun. And in particular in Ethiopia, we have all the four of them. But of course, the lion's share in the future of the renewables will be achieved through wind and solar that are the fastest growing technologies with reducing unitary cost of technology and improved performances that were so fast in the deployment. Also thanks to the Western countries that maybe try to mitigate a little bit their moral anxiety for what we have done in the past century and paid massive subsidies to renewables to implement in Europe, bringing renewables to the absolute cost competitiveness. So this is the, let's say, probably the gift that we give to the global sustainability from Europe to the world, because the development of renewables happens basically in the last 20 years in Europe and maybe a little bit in the United States. So now a fact that probably you don't know is that today it's cheaper to build a solar and a wind farm rather than to build a coal or gas plant. It's cheaper. Also, not only faster, it's absolutely cheaper. And in modern economies, and in few years also in Africa, it will become cheaper to build a new solar and wind project than to operate an existing coal or gas plant. This is a phenomenon that's called the energy transition, which is happening in South America, in the United States, in Europe, and will happen also in Africa. Of course, the problem of Africa is not to transition, it's to add new capacity. That's why the phenomenon will happen later. Cheaper, we said, significant abundance of, and most importantly, this is the only solution that is compliant and compatible with the Sustainable Development Goals set by the United Nations. I mean, if you think about it, there is this very little sense, if no sense, if in Europe we work hard to achieve our RED 2 goals, that is to be by 2030 at 62% of renewables. Maybe United States at the federal level, we know that now it's not very popular, but for sure at the state level like California, Florida, they are all setting very high ambitious targets of renewable penetration. So think about all this immense effort to clean up the energy metrics of the modern economies while we have Africa accessing to electricity for the 600 million of people using conventional fossil fuels, which means that the target of 1.5 degrees will be never achieved. So that's not a problem of Africa, it's a problem of the globe. So if we don't talk with a global view of this problem, we will never achieve even the European targets, because they will be absolutely meaningless. So if all this is true, what we have in front of us is an immense opportunity of investments for private and public capital. So renewables will move from 20% penetration today to more than about 40% in 2030 and more than 60% in 2050. Leapfrogging, as David said, from the conventional, from the access to the not access to electricity directly to the most competitive, less polluting, and easiest to be implemented technology that is available today, without having paid the cost for it, because as we said, today they are already in the money, as we say. So today, solar power, wind power are cheaper than conventional fuels. So if all this is true, what are the technical solutions that we have to put in place? So we said most of the population will be living in the peri-urban area, so that's why we believe that utility-scale, grid-connected projects are crucial to really offer an opportunity to the African economy to continue to grow in a stable and sustained way. But of course, let's not. So about 70% of Africans will have access to electricity actually from grid-connected utility-scale projects. But then let's not forget that the 30% of Africans that are living far away from cities, they will still need other technologies like the mini-grids or the home solar systems. These 30% will represent 200 million people, so it's not a minority, a minor problem. It's still a very important problem. So we have to divide the problem into two things. One thing is to the establishment of a strong, fast, robust programs for the access to electricity and the strengthening of the electricity system of the so-called utility scale grid-connected systems, which implies also heavy investments in grid infrastructure, but on the other side also to find what are the regulatory innovations and improvements that are needed for private capital to flow into the so-called mini-grid schemes that today has been absolutely ineffective and unsuccessful on continental scale. We have a field experience. We've been working for years in Africa. When I say we, I see Enel Green Power, but also all the fellows of Rest for Africa. And there has been basically no program that has been absolutely successful. But most of the programs have some good things in it, like the REAP program in South Africa, the program of Morocco. But of course, those are the two, let's say, extreme in the continent, so probably not absolutely replicable in other countries of the continent. So there is one project, the one program that is still ongoing, which has been very successful, but absolutely not impactful, that is scaling solar. Because not impactful, because only few megawatts has been able to be connected to the grid so far. But it's by far the most best designed program so far. So we said, as European members, citizens, but also as a European enterprises, we want to cooperate all together to come up with the best possible program supported by Europe, but that it will involve private capitals from wherever they will come to foster the renewables developments in Africa. And that's the program that we have called Renew Africa, in which we are cooperating with more than 30 players in the entire value chain of renewables, which is being designed as we speak. We have been launching this a few days ago in Rome with a quite successful event that created some, let's say, attention also from the media. And we are now in the phase of establishing the pillars of this program with the aim to go to Europe and propose this as a stimulus package from Europe to Africa, of course with the involvement of African governments and African institutions, in a convergence of interest between the European industry, the European players, the European politics, and of course the African countries, as you know, the neighbors of a global world in which all together can work to really make the projection of IEA draw, which means that by 2030 the Africans will be all living with access to electricity. And with this I finish, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonello, for the perspective you share with us.
Did I improve it?
As
Did I improve
usual,
it?
yes, so
Thank
you
you.
will be invited back. So now, and I would like to start with the questions, and we are very happy to have Barasonga with us today. And Vera is the Executive Economic Commission for Africa, and she also has a past experience at the World Bank. So, Vera, I would like to start with you, if you don't mind. So, how can a steady regulatory framework in the 54 African countries ensure a wide adoption of renewable energy and the development of energy infrastructure in the African continent?
First of all, thank you for inviting us to focus. I think
Oh, sorry, the microphone. Yes. And switch it on. Just. Yes.
yes.
Success.
Lights on. Yeah. No, I thank you for having me on Focus On. I think three things when we talk about regulation. The first one is predictability. And then I think when we look at what the businesses say they need from Africa, they're looking for energy, but before energy you need predictability. You need a utility that can actually afford to pay the current prices. And then you need a regulatory environment that sets the prices that are market reflective. And I think that once you have that, because every business that comes, now we know how to do IPPs on the continent or independent power purchases. I think where we have a little bit more problem on the continent is with the utilities and the regulatory framework. And once you have that, then there is more business that comes. Before you get to that, or part of strengthening the utility is really then looking at the countries have overall energy strategies. And I think a lot of the conversation that we're talking about here, which is a conversation on moving and accelerating access to clean energy in Africa, means that countries do need to have a strategy and a policy for their energy mix going forward, which is part of the regulatory framework to say, in the next 5 years, we're going to move from coal or from, as the minister said in Guinea, he's going to move from coal to maybe geothermal and solar and wind, but he needs to be able to communicate that to the market so that the market knows what it is that the government's mixes, that they can come in and invest. So I think it's essentially three things. It's first a good utility, a pricing regulatory authority that works, that is market reflective and not politics dependent, and then finally an overall energy strategy that has clarity in direction and is not changing.
Thank you. And actually, we have another question for you. Investments in renewable energy in Africa are growing, but still a slower pace than what is needed to guarantee access to energy to the 600 million people. So how could it be possible to encourage private investment to accelerate the process?
I think the first thing is what we're doing here today, and the Renew Africa initiative. And I used to be at the IFC, so I'm happy that you say that scaling solar was a good initiative. I think, as Churchill said, until we get a better deal, we like the one that we have. And for now, I think scaling solar is what's on the market. And really what it is that, and this is where Renew Africa comes in, is that when we look at accelerating energy access, you can't look at it as an independent node. You do really need to look at the whole overall program and the overall strategy. And three things that we look at when we do that is to say, first of all, where do countries want to go? What is it that you can do? The private sector essentially needs, and I think this is the conversation we're having, to be able to get the last mile, you need a certain amount of risk mitigation. I think it's clear that, in dense urban areas like Lagos and Nairobi and to some extent Addis Abeba, you don't need any blended financing or any sort of buying down of capital. But for most of the continent, you still do need that. And so you need, and then we also have the question of political risk guarantees and insurance that give a little bit more credibility. But I think conversations like this are important because a lot of the discussion on the continent now is also about the sort of clarity of the risk perception on the continent. And that goes back to your first question in terms of the regulatory environment. I think on the continent we have advanced. You have countries like Senegal, you have countries like Kenya. I think you were talking about power pools and selling energy. In West Africa we have, for the last 30 years, been selling energy between Guinea, Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, and that's working and working well. And I think once you establish that kind of credibility, then the private sector is more interested in coming because the utility can actually pay back. The other part of the conversation is really the consumer and regulation around ensuring that you have consumers that can actually afford it and that can actually pay. And I think we have seen in South Africa again that when you actually do regulation that ensures that you can catch and attract more buyers onto the grid because the energy is stable and reliable and that you don't have cuts, then you begin to attract more and more of the private sector. So I think it's three things. It's first having, again, it's a program. It's having a country that has clarity of direction, having a series of financial instruments that can ensure the private sector that when they come in, because the private sector, let's not forget, comes in for a return. They don't come in as much as they want to give light to Africa, and we're very happy, they come in for a return. And so we do need to ensure that that return is guaranteed in there. But then as we move over time, we do need, as was the case in Latin America, as was the case in East Asia, to provide some blending so that they can come in, they can understand the market. I think that today, if Enel is in Africa, it's because you have a long history. You understand the market, you know where the pitfalls are, and you have developed risk mitigation instruments that can help you do that. And I think the Renew for Africa program is saying, can we take it to scale? If we continue at the pace that we are, which is essentially putting about 1,000 megawatts per year, and the demand is at 15,000 megawatts per year, we would never meet it. So essentially, I think the challenge that Renew Africa is saying is, can we produce more, generate more energy than the demand that is growing? And it is this kinds of partnerships that would deliver that.
Thank you so much. So now it's time for our experts here. Who wants to break the ice? Yes?
You are the specialist, Roberto.
Roberto Vigotti, I'm the Secretary General of the restaurant.
Is it on?
Yeah.
The computer? Okay.
Yes, I have the pleasure to coordinate the Rest for Africa Foundation, which now is a new aggressive foundation working with Africans. Now, I just want to mention two things. First of all, when we started, when I'm the grandfather of renewable, it used to be called the Cinderella option when we started, and now we are going to court now. Integration was the name of the game. Now, all of you talk about transition. I think you have to change it to the World Bank now last name, transformation. You have to transform the energy system. That's why the minister of whatever it is really funny, because of course he's defending his vested interest. But transformation means also sector coupling, meaning that maybe not only electricity in the power sector, but also addressing the beyond the meter and also e-mobility and also every year we open a country. Now we're going to go to Ghana. Now in Ghana, we found out that the take-or-pay block on the people from fossil fuel, they sell their gas to them, and they have a take-or-pay block, so they cannot do any renewable unless something changes. So this is also, to me, a scandal, but also the people should react for that. Additional demand from Ghana to go there and do renewable, but it's also a problem of consistency. And we needed badly to have the COP to tell us how to renew. Now we go to Paris or to wherever to provide solution, and not anymore doing climate change at the vision said there. So I think we have many things to be done in Africa, and I assure you that UNECA can count on us for that.
Thank you, Roberto. Yeah.
Thank you, Enel Green Power. Thank you to Enel for this meeting, which is a great opportunity for people like me. I am Guido Talarico. I am a publisher. I work here. And the things that is very clear to me is that the fact that energy is a key factor for everybody, not just for the operators. Energy means giving more people the chance to be informed, so has a strong impact to democracy, to the civil life of those countries. And they're not these countries. There are some countries that are accepting so for me, it's not a secondary question, the fact that access moved very fast. But let me be a bit, lots of good news and good things, but there are factors that to me it's not always working. And I mean, I'm referring to the fact of the law system, always works as they should. operators to participate, to enter in different countries. So I have a question for you, Antonello. Is Africa mature for that? How does it matter? Speed? That's a question.
No, my frank answer is that Africa is not mature. Of course, there are countries like South Africa, all the conditions, including speed and stability and vision of future, to attract investments from private capitals, not only foreign capital. There were local capitals invested in these two countries. So what the investor needs is stability, we said, relatively stability. We are also living in the modern era, so we don't understand that changes are predictable and logical, evolving alongside the evolution of technology or the general market as an effect of a lobby of the hysteria of a politician. So what real investor wants is, let's say, predictability more than stability. The second thing is we want to have a vision. We want to have a plan for maybe 5 years, 10 years, especially if countries are asking for local content. Localization is a very difficult thing for technology, for the creation of expertise, of new professionalism, and especially for the localization of manufacturing. The third thing that is needed is execution skills. So most of these two countries were quite effective to implement the programs according to the time schedule that was envisaged when they started. In the rest of Africa, this is the most dramatic problem. There are two things lacking in Africa, in my opinion. One are projects, and the reason why projects are lacking because there are not enough professionals that are working, investing their time and money in building projects. Now I'm referring to renewables, but I think the same problem is maybe in many other industries. And the second is that inevitably we need an interaction with the public bodies for regulation, for connection, for permitting, and the time provision, it's absolutely uncertain. So, for example, in this country, I mean, I can say easily, we are waiting since 2 years. We are the awarded company of the first tendering that has been carried on very well in a very transparent way according to international standards. We are the awarded company, but still waiting to sign the PPA. 2 years. I said, to build the plant, we need 8 months. So this plant, according to the original plans, should have been already operating. We're still waiting to sign the PPA. And this is the dramatic waste of time and opportunities. Where there will be people, job creation, education, training done around this project. Not to mention the convergence project of water, electricity, and food, the so-called smart extensions, which is our project to enlarge around the area of the presence of the power plant, emerging mini-grids to deliver power in the proximity of the large utility scale. So converging the two possible schemes of the mini-grids and the utility scale into one big development in the local area. So the capability of a country to be predictable, to respect the time schedule, it's absolutely crucial. That's why we created it. That's why scaling solar, first of all, it's a appreciable program because it's mandating quite strictly the phases in which the program should be developed and tried also to maintain some guidance on the speed. Some guidance, because we had slippages also in scaling solar, but absolutely not comparable to the ones we had in Morocco, that we had in other countries, in Ethiopia, and including South Africa, that screwed up a little bit. Sorry to be rude, but they went very well, round 1, round 2, round 3, round 3.5, round 4, and then decided to completely mess it up. Now they are back on track, I guess. So the fact that scaling solar created a very strict milestone is absolutely important because it's trying to, let's say, to solve one of the historical problems of implementing capital projects in Africa, which is the predictability. And it's not perfect. We have understood it's not perfect. That's why copying them, we declared from the beginning, so leapfrogging from scaling solar, together with some of the scaling solar pioneers, Vera is trying to help us a lot. We are working the Renew Africa exactly for the reason we want the Renew Africa to be the program to which African governments want to apply, because they will get a very narrow band into which to move to deliver project according to the scale. This will be like a magnet for private capital to flow into this. It will be a very powerful magnet. I don't know if we will succeed, but we are putting all our passion and heart and time and money also around this program. Let's see.
David, I can see you have the microphone, but actually there is just one question that came from home, let's say, from the people who's following us through our social media channels. And so shall we give the space to Francesco? He's asking, we heard about the ambitious Renew Africa program that should enable private investments in renewables from UE countries to be more efficiently directed to Africa. What do you think would be the key to realize it? And I think, Vera, this is another question possibly for you.
No, thank you. I think, let me build upon a little bit what Antonio said. First of all, it will be a partnership. It will not be investments from Europe into Africa. There are quite a large number of African developers as well, and I think that that's where projects succeed. And Antonio mentioned the localization concept. It's essentially when you work with local partners, the probability that you go faster is higher. But we have progressed on the continent. We've made some, I think, great strides. There is no longer that, I think there's some agreements. Nobody now disputes the need for private capital in energy generation. Nobody disputes the need for private capital in energy transmission. I think those are what one would call acquis. The question now is, how can you do it quickly? How can you do it fast? And in what way? And I think this is, again, the beauty of the Renew Africa is what is for a long time, African countries did not understand what the road to travel was. And every company had a different set of requirements. Now we know that when you come, you have to do your environmental and social study. And we have a pair of people that would look at it and ensure that it works. And if it doesn't work, then you have to redo it. And the state understands that. And I think there was also the conversation around, what was, social responsibility versus what was investment, and how you price those things. And there was so much confusion. And I think, again, the beauty of scaling solar and now Renew Africa is there's not going to be confusion between what is social capital and what is private capital, because therein also lies some of the complication on the continent, has been this mix. And I think clarity from the private sector on what is private capital that deserves and requires a private return, and what is social capital that does not need to happen if you pay your taxes, is okay. So that is, I think, a very, very fundamental part. Is first, the continent is open, the continent understands, but then the third part, and I think this is, again, what Antonio was talking about, is our utilities. We now all understand that getting a viable, sustainable, strong, and efficient utility is good, but I think 70% of our utilities are still not there. A lot of our utilities are still loss-making. But this is why this argument for access to renewable energy is interesting, because a lot of our utilities are either bankrupt or about to be bankrupt because we've been using the wrong energy. And the cost of that energy is just as volatile as our growth. And the payment by our customers is just as volatile. And if we can transition into an energy where it's more affordable and more accessible, you get more clients. You get scale. I think David was the one talking about scale. You get scale at lower cost. We grow faster and you pay. And there's many countries that we see as they move to cleaner energy and more access, the utilities become more efficient, the utilities become more viable, and they get more IPP. So I think it's that combination of the conversation that really needs to happen. And my sense is that as local African investors, European investors, and others come together, we should be able to solve the problem.
Thank you so much, Vera. And we know that
Isabella, if I may add something,
yes.
the question said, what is key for the success? In my view, as the father of Renew Africa, if I may, I think there will be two things that are absolutely key. And this is the political will of Europe and the political will of African Union as the ensemble of the African governments. If these two political bodies want to do it, we will succeed. Because on a technical level, it's easy. We will be working and we will create the best possible package, starting from the field experience of the operators. I would just want to remember something. All of the project done in South Africa has been developed by South Africans developers. So 100% of them were developed South African developers. Why? Because the program was conceived in such a way that many engineering firms or entrepreneurs decided to put their capital at risk developing projects. So the private capital could build on this availability of projects. So that's what we would like to replicate in the New Africa. But to move from a fantastic package to a real program, we need two things: the political will of Europe and the acceptance from African governments. I say African Union because I think it will have a very important role in saying that this is useful, not the only one program, but a useful program to try to accelerate. It will be one of the program, of course.
Thank you. And we know that Vera needs to run away, so thank you so much to join us. It was a real pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you, and good luck. We all hope that this program that will contribute to succeed.
Thank you so
Vera.
much. So our conversation keep on going. So David, you have the microphone ready.
No, please, Will, we can do it in private. But I have a technical question, I guess, in the sense that they could both, Antonello, but anyone else that wants to, is very interested. One is just technically, if I wanted to set up a manufacturing plant here, let's say of light electronics, or let's say a car plant, or let's, go to an extreme, an aluminium smelter. Can I do that with solar power? I simply don't know the answer. I mean, is that possible, both in terms of the amount of energy produced and the predictability of that energy? Some process and at the end of the day. And the second question is also a kind of technical question. It's to do with, because I'm fascinated with what the obstacles are. When someone says, this is easy, we can just build, my journalist is, well, then why isn't it being done? In the which is life. I mean, that's what life's about. One of them, I suspect, is tariffs. That there's this idea that that energy is a right, and therefore the energy tariff should be such that people can afford it. Unfortunately, that tariff may mean that it's not profitable for a company to produce it, and the upshot of that is utility companies, as we've heard, that are bankrupt, that can't pay their bills, etc., etc. So I'm interested in both those, in a sense, technical questions. And please, anybody else that would like to contribute, I'd be very interested in hearing.
About the first, the short answer is yes and no. And I'll explain you why. That's why we say that we need a grid. If you are thinking of an aluminum smelter or a car manufacturing assembly line, you're talking of very intense energy consumer. So you're not thinking of an off-grid set of panels that are just fueling during the day time the factory. You are talking of something that is severe, very intense in terms of energy consumption. That's why we say that we need a development of a utility scale grid-connected projects. Then remember that developing solar energy or wind energy, it happens also in, for example, in Ethiopia, would be absolutely well complementing the abundance of hydro resources that are still in the country, and this is pretty much true in all the energy systems of Africa. So you have not to consider the availability of one single source. That's why the planning of energy, the energy system, it's a very crucial practice that in many countries actually it's carried on by an authority. So you have to plan it in a very wise way so that you can have flexibility, abundance of resources, complementarity, and as somebody mentioned, also sector coupling, because of course coupling with different uses of electricity, you can create the flexibility that you need. But for now in Africa, talking of a transformation, in my opinion, it's a little bit a waste of time. We have to talk of access to electricity. That's the urgency that we have to solve. With solar, you can do it in an easy and cheap way, of course, putting this in the context of an existing grid. So you can provide stability and competitive electricity to the uses, industrial uses of electricity. But the role of a grid is unavoidable. The role of the grid is unavoidable for an industrialization. I mean, thinking of a completely decentralize a system with factories, so far, it's absolutely silly. I mean, it's not happening, not even in Europe or United States. So the two things must go together. Now, coming to the second question about the affordability, there is no other source of power cheaper than solar and wind. I repeat again, there is no other source of power today cheaper and subsidized, cheaper than solar and wind. The entire question of sustainability of utility is very huge, very fragmented. So ESCOM is not in the same situation of EEP, which is not in the same situation of NE Morocco. So it's a matter of management quality, transparency, rules, and many other technical like energy mix and many other things. But it's a fact. Introducing renewables will reduce the electricity bill. Will reduce the electricity bill, no doubt.
Yes, go.
If I may, my name is John Ethamith. I'm coming from Siemens Gamesa as African Market Development Director. We are one of the global leading wind turbine manufacturers. We have been in Africa for long, since 1980s. And I fully endorse what have been said here in the roundtable, in the panel, in the sense of what can be, I mean, Africa is giving a momentum. Africa, we, from the European perspective, we have been able to, as Antonella was saying, we have been able to develop the cheapest source of energy currently with renewables. At the very beginning, when we expanded renewables to other parts of the globe, to the United States, to Asia, to Latin America, we were not at the same cost path as we are today. So we consider that it is a matter of partnership between the European industrial partners and African partners in order to grandfather the opportunity that they have to leapfrog as not as the transformation. We are talking about new generation. One of the challenges that we see is that some of the projects that we have been benchmarking 10 years to go until financial close, not even until commissioning, but until financial close. Because wind projects, for example, they were started in Africa by entrepreneurs. A man put in a tent near a lake. He saw that it was wind, and suddenly he thought, okay, why don't we match wind with wind energy? And then it started to evolve and progress about the idea. Currently, and I think David has also explained, the equation is crystal clear. Africa is growing. There is a willingness by African governments to push this growth with renewables. Africa is endowed with vast renewable energy sources, so the cheapest. I may not agree with the statement of the minister saying that it is cheapest to drive what energy they want. It is somehow true, but it is a chicken and egg topic. So you should educate consumers about what is the cheapest source of energy, how you are going to be lowering the cost of the electricity bill. So we consider that, for example, Renew Africa, together with the scaling solar and potentially with the scaling wind, nobody in the globe has got the opportunity to grandfather and to match energy demand, renewable sources, with the willingness from the European perspective to untap full potential of renewables. So what is the reason why accelerating access to clean energy is not happening yet? Well, we are putting the tools. There is a clear willingness, and it will happen in the short term. We are sure for that, and we are fully committed to that.
Thank you so much. Yes?
Hi, this works, I suppose. Good. I'm Anna, I'm with Risk for Africa Foundation, and we've been committed to advancing energy access across Africa since the very beginning. And clearly, there's no doubt that Africa's future, its energy future at least, is entirely within renewables. But as we've progressed in our analysis, we also that energy access can actually achieve much more than we may think. And we see now that besides the 600 million, that really big number that we all have very vastly present in our minds, besides those 600 million people within Africa that don't have access to energy, We also see that hundreds of millions of Africans don't have access to other vital building blocks of an economy as well, which is water and food. Around 370 million people don't have access to safely drinking water. Around 700 million don't have access to secure food. And we find that that is a huge challenge, but also indicates something in terms of synergies. Those issues are clearly interlinked. And it means that there are opportunities there for energy access to also advance and bring us really closer to solving those resource challenges as well. And this is something that's captured within a theory called the water energy food nexus that proposes a very interesting alternative for the energy sector as well in terms of finding a strategy for energy access. It's clear that given the scale of the electrification challenge across Africa, we're going to need a vast set of strategies, of technologies, of solutions. And I do think that thinking outside of the box a little bit, looking beyond energy and across the aisle towards water, towards agriculture, and what that can achieve is going to help us get there. It's going to help us get there. It's going to be a puzzle of solutions, really. And one of the things that we're working on this year is to identify whether energy access can be achieved by looking through those other sectors as well. And they really do give us an opportunity to meet these resource needs, as well as create actually energy access markets that right now might not be immediately identifiable, because they can help us create captive markets, they can help us grow demand that currently is not there quite yet. It can help us achieve local development benefits that are spillover. And really we try to put the focus, the spotlight a little bit on going towards interrelated thinking. The SDGs, actually, the Sustainable Development Goals, are based on that type of thinking. Look at what you can achieve in one goal by looking towards all the interconnection that may be there in terms of itself. And then I really think that we can create a lot of momentum to grow to where we want to go in ways that actually grow beyond. We kind of have these wonderful spillover effects towards sustainable development overall. And energy is at the core of this, without a doubt.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me and allow me to play the devil's advocate here. So I hear everyone saying Africa's future, this is what Africa needs, the renewables, the clean energy. As an environmentalist, I totally agree. I always sit back in a panel and ask myself, is this what Africa wants? Or is this what Africa needs? One. And I'm asking this because go call. Yeah? What are they missing? We know. So I'm looking at it from both sides. And then, does Africa have a choice in terms of, and there's no one else giving you clean energy? Are you going to sit back for your people? Remember, politicians are only in power to be elected. It's not about the people. So you have to stay there. It's true for African governments. Some. You are there to be elected and re-elected. And therefore, if this Chinese person, and sorry, I pick your words, says that I'm going to give you coal as power, what can the African government or the African person say that I won't take your coal? So it makes me wonder, do African governments have, what do I put it, do they have a choice in energy? Or do you accept what is put at your feet?
Of course they have choice. Politics, first of all, China is not giving nothing for free. They will take back to China with interest, whatever they're bringing to Africa, first of all. Choose coal now, you will basically not leapfrog and experience what is happening in Latin America and in Europe anymore. So it's just an incredible waste of time. Now, there are two things I believe are driving countries in the wrong direction. One is most of politicians are old-minded or old in general. Too old.
With no vision.
And somewhat ignorant, most of the time. And the second is that it's a very sad thing. Countries want to do their own mistakes. They don't really like to learn from experience of other countries. This has been an experience we have done in renewables for the last 20 years. I have 20 years of experience in renewables, I started in 2001. And anytime we go in a country, in these 20 years, the questions were always the same. They are volatile, they are unpredictable, they cannot do more than 5% in a system. And despite the technological evolution, the increase in the production cost, the increase in technology performances and stuff like that, when you go in a new country want to fail on their own and fix it by their own. It's unavoidable. That's why we're working on Renew Africa, though, because we believe that bringing the experience of other countries, maybe also from Africa itself, we can move a little bit the needle of the compass towards more renewables. Remember, in South Africa for some years they've been talking of nuclear under the Zuma political period. Now nuclear is no longer in the policy anymore. So I don't think Africa should be scared too much of old-minded politicians that may think that coal is the future. Because sooner or later, if younger, more competent politicians will come on stage, then we'll see what's happening all around the world, and we'll have one simple question to answer to the political basis, that is, why Africa is different. There is no reason. Same sun, same wind, same water, same natural resources, and same people. Because we are all the same. We consume electricity basically all in the same way as we get in love. There is a parallel between how we get in love and how we consume electricity. There is no difference in, say, in age, culture, history, or whatever. So there is no reason why you should. So if Africa wants, I don't know, but it's that's why I think the oil minister is wrong, because the young generation, the 19 years old Africans, is what they want, and what they want sooner or later will become what countries have to do. Remember that you don't vote only when you go to elections. You vote every day when you buy something. That's the power you can exert in your life, the power of consumption. And when consumers will start consuming only sustainable product, they will ask for sustainable electricity in the product, even in Africa. This is the moment in which the coal plant will be shut down or even not built at all. So, but we need some communication around it. We need to bring. It's not unavoidable. Africa can leapfrog. Actually, it's already leapfrogging. Okay.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much. Let me build on the issue raised by Anna, which I think is absolutely fundamental, Antonio, and it is the fact that we needed to encourage conversations across sectors. There is a lot of concern about the issue of food waste, for instance. But food waste is closely connected to lack of electricity, not only in the rural areas, also in the urban areas. So I believe that the work that we all have to do, of course, through Rest for Africa, Renew Africa, is also to reach out and speak to others. And I think we have to keep doing that, because it's also about information, education, and for people to know what their options are, not only the individual consumers, but also industries and etc. And I know that every country wants to make their own mistakes. That's for sure. But I think that there are lessons learned from some continents that will be very useful for the others. We keep saying, and that's our aspiration, I am from Latin America, we would like to see an evolution of electricity and access to electricity in Africa as we have seen it in Latin America. What have we learned from Latin America that we can tell the Africans in case they want to use some of those lessons for their own benefit? And that question is for you.
Well, what we have learned from Latin America is the following. You need time, a lot of time. Latin America, it took like 15 years in Latin America because I actually started from Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala. We were developing project in geothermal, in hydro, because solar and wind was not existing at them, was still in the lab. Okay, it takes time, and we went to regulator, to policymakers. I remember in 2005 or 6, I went in Brazil. Brazil now is a giant country in the wind sector. It's one of the strongest wind market in the world. We were going there by explaining what was the wind power and then the solar. We had to do the same for solar a few years later. So it needs time. it needs facts. You have to bring the rich conventional wisdom, myth, hot air all around. It has been in Europe, in the United States, and now in Latin America, and so there is no reason why this should not happen in Africa as well. But as for the technological improvement, the discussion period will, I think, elapse very quickly. So unless you have a different agendas, for different reasons. So if you are genuinely open to a discussion of what is the future of electricity in Africa, this will take the technocrats from the utilities will have to immediately understand that they are just too old to run this program, and they have to leave the space to younger managers that are more fresh and more open to technology improvements. That's unavoidable. Or maybe they will embrace the new technology that are not new at all. That's the most important thing. It's becoming absolutely mainstream everywhere around the world. So we have countries in Europe with days and days of more than 50, 60, 70% of renewable penetration, and there is no collapse of the grids whatsoever. We had a very nice case in Australia where there was a blackout, and of course immediately all the newspapers and the technicians were blaming the wind farms as the cause of these blackouts, and then the investigation turns out to be the incompetence, or let's say not enough knowledge of the system operator that didn't know that when you have a certain issue in the grid, to protect themselves, the wind farm disconnect and then reconnect into the grid. So just to tell you, this is Australia, by the way, so a very modern and evolved country. So it's an inevitable discussion that you have to bring over. The things I believe from Latin America will bring easily to Africa is that renewables are not a phenomenon for emerging from developed world. Actually, is the solution for emerging world. Absolutely applicable to fragile networks, absolutely applicable to emerging economies, and actually is probably the solution. Remember one thing. A project in renewable is doable starting with a magnitude of few millions of euros or dollars. While on the contrary, when you are promoting combined cycle or coal plants or large hydro projects, you are condemning in the state-controlled, large, massive, unpredictable kind of investments that will lag for years and years in a non-transparent way, with a direct negotiation of between one or two Chinese players. This is not what I think Africa wants. I think we want a transparent contentability of, and this is the lesson that Latin America understood immediately. Actually, Latin America didn't apply feed-in tariff, I don't think in any country. Probably Pro-Infa in Brazil in 2002 or 2003. Most of the development in Latin America was on a pure competitive basis, or, like in Chile, competitive basis including conventional fossil fuel and existing plants. So there was absolutely no form of preferentiality for the renewable power. So you imagine the level of stress we had on us? When I say we, I mean the renewable industry. It was immense. And this is the reason why today Africa can benefit from the pure competitiveness that we have achieved. So there are many lessons that can be learned, but I think there will be no lesson applicable if there is no political will. And the political will must be the reflection of a population will that only the media can bring to the attention of politicians. So I think there is a very key role of media to show that a different path is doable.
Thank you. And sorry, we have another question from the social media, if we can show it. The African continent lacks energy, which has a strong impact on economic growth and social development. What is the role of private enterprise in this context? David, would you like to answer that?
Sure, I can have a go. I can have a go, although I suspect there are other people that maybe can speak with more authority than I. Clearly they have a role. They have the technology, they have the expertise, and provided the right framework, and this is crucial. provided the right framework, you know, they're liable to come in and invest, because clearly there are huge opportunities here. But having the right framework is key. That means the right regulatory framework, the right tariff framework, the predictability that we've spoken about, the political will. Then both the public and the private sector have big roles to play.
Thank you. Yeah?
No, I was just going to explain a bit our private sector. I fully endorse also what Antonello was saying. We need political commitment. We need pipeline. Currently, I think that all the installed capacity in Africa is 42 gigawatts for all energy sources, and there is a potential of 310 gigawatts of renewables, modern renewables, to be installed, so sevenfolding the current potential. As a private investor, for example, a clear and stable market foster investment of Siemens Gamesa in Morocco. We opened the first Middle East and Africa wind turbine component manufacturing plant we have in Tangier, a blade manufacturing plant with 600 people, local people employed. The direct ones, indirect ones, you multiply it by 2, and those people have been trained in our facilities in the UK, in Denmark. So if you are providing private investors with a stable pipeline, they will be willing to invest, not only because of the social impact that it may have, of course, but because there is economic rationale behind. It is the cheapest source of energy, and as it was explained, it is the quickest deliverable energy, but it is also true that a wind farm may be built in 8 to 12 months. But hopefully, and it does, it's going to be standing for 20, 25, 30, 40 years. And you need local people for operation and maintenance. So you will be training those local people because, not because you are operating in the country, but there is economic rationale to train those people to grow the economy, to increase the energy demand, instead of bringing foreign people to work in a domestic. So everything, I mean, it's a vicious circle. The more stable the pipeline, the more economic rationale and the willingness for the private to invest. And we can showcase.
Thank you. Please.
Well, thank you. My name's Jesper Hornberg. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, non è on.
Gibbons, yes, we worked in. Should I try this one instead? Yes.
Questo è on.
Thank you. In Africa, well, this is a great start, by the way, to my little speech here. For about 10 years, distributing to the 200 million people we referred to before. So really going off-grid where there is no grid in the foreseeable future. And first I just want to compliment the two framing speakers, because it's a really good, and I've seen a lot of presentations on really good way to get that started, and they really wouldn't challenge anything you talk about. Referencing what Anna was talking about, the nexus. Energy is at the center of a lot of things. I would say everything. I was brought up in Sweden, and to me it's not only a human right, it's part of what gives me dignity, and what gives my kids dignity. Homework, have a hot shower, cook proper food, services electricity leads to when it comes to water purification, when it comes to transportation, logistics, and so on. So it's a super important aspect. That leads me to my question, and I'm not sure it's directed at anyone, but it's directed at all of us, I guess. Why we do it? What is it that we're trying to address? And if we start trying to understand that and lift people into that space of dignity, where they can do what we take for granted that you can do, then we've achieved something, and that it sort of perpetuates itself. Our approach is not to build big power plants. I do some work professionally on the side of gigawatts on that, so I understand the importance of it, and you need to do that. You need to continue doing it. But it's about understanding how to get people onto the energy ladder so that they start using it. An East African country recently connected 1 million households in 1 year, and the impact on baseload was 1%, which means that either the number is not accurate, or even if it's half, 1% is nothing. It means they just use the light bulb, so they need to start using it for other reasons as well. I also think private sector role, I think what Enel is doing and has been doing since I started engaging with them about 8 years ago, is very important. These conversations in these spaces. Not trying to praise you too much because then you might stop, but continue doing it. I think it's very important, including African participants as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
But basically, I want to unveil a secret. The reason why we're doing it is very simple. First, of course, we have a vision. We have a vision of sustainability, of human progress, but we want to make money out of it. And we are completely convinced that making renewables in Europe, in Africa, is an immense opportunity for profit, for the private capital, from wherever they will come, for a, let's say, relatively safe return. So, the idea of Renew Africa is not, to clarify this, is not the idea of an immense subsidy package that for some strange reason Europe should dedicate to Africa. It's creating a bigger market where European enterprises, European players, African enterprises, African players can cooperate to make money, solving one of the fundamental issues of Africa, which is at the center of what we call creating shared value. We will make money by solving a social need. That's why we're doing it. So it's completely transparent.
Exactly, and I think it's, of course, but it's the key. You need to address money. Here you have a definite need and a real problem, and the means to solve it.
Right. Hopefully, yes.
I was going to comment the exact same thing because I think the more that we go around the renewable energy community, the international development dialogues, we see much more increasing their presence of private sector and the demand, the necessity for private sector to step up, to be present, to lead the dialogue and to be part of the solution. And it really means that once we identify priorities within all these dialogues, we really need private sector to make it happen, to come to action, because really it is a unique type of actor within an ecosystem of actors that can do things that others simply cannot. And I actually personally, blame it on the fact that I'm a millennial or something, but this is why I personally love to work in the field of renewable energy, especially in Africa, because it marries intersection of business opportunities, which is a pragmatic type of solution, a pragmatic type of approach, and still linking towards sustainability, which is more visionary, more towards somewhere we want to go. It is a roadmap. It is somewhere a bit of a dream where we want to head towards. And I'm personally very happy to see that and to work within a space where that is somehow slowly merging. And I think in Africa right now, with the discussion that we're having now, with this big strategy that needs to take place, the challenges are huge for sure, but the opportunities are probably even bigger. And that sounds even more cliche than anything else. But really, everything is to be built. Absolutely, everything is to be built from scratch. There's people to be empowered, businesses to be started, to be helped to take off. There's communities to be really that can take off as well, and nations to be built up on this path. And really, actually, Africa can do it in a new way that we have not. That in Europe has not taken place. We can do better, and to be part of that story is something that I find personally very exciting within Rest for Africa Foundation, within here we did Enel focus on, here in Addis Ababa. I think we're on the right track.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe, Chiara, you want to add something?
Yes. Yeah, I'm Chiara, and Future Food Institute, which is an NGO based in Italy, work on an international level on create capacity and knowledge on sustainable innovation in the food system. So I'm actually happy to segue on what Anna was saying about a nexus and about the importance of linking energy with food. I'm really fascinated by your angle, saying that consumers are actually driving most of what is happening and is supposed to happen. And I think also our experience has been really focused on that in other parts of the world, where actually sustainable food consumptions, where energy plays a huge role in the food sector, has been driven by consumers that are now more aware, more educated, and are asking for a better food. So I know this continent has different challenges because there is also a problem of food accessibility. But I'm wondering I think from everybody, especially from David, also like coming from a perspective which is more cross-sector. I'm wondering which are the main tools and activities that we can bring to this country, to this continent, that are driving behavior change, that are specifically successful in this continent with this different culture. Because I'm aware that what has been successful for us in Europe or in both North and South America in terms of behavior change cannot be exactly replicated in this part of the world to drive consumer choices. So I'm just curious to see if there is anybody that has a clue on that.
I don't have a clue. Yes.
Let me see if I can help, because again, it's a very important question. I'm going to repeat what I have said before. I have been working in the area of rural development for many years. And we have been aspiring to bring transformation in the rural sector in Africa. We have been working to bring productivity. But then we realized that you cannot do that without electricity. And once we have realized that, there is a conversation at the moment going on between Rest for Africa, for instance, and FAO, IFAD, and the agencies working on the food sector to look at new business models in which you can integrate electricity and energy as part of the production, productivity, irrigation type of business model, to see how we can increase productivity, bring electricity to the communities, but also find a new way of delivering food to people at a price that is affordable with a technology that is modern. I think it's work in progress. Many people are working on that. Some of the colleagues working on microgrid, on smart extension. Everybody's looking for new models. But the truth is that slowly, slowly, we are understanding that it's absolutely necessary to break the silos and to start looking for new models.
Just let me share a model that has worked. So in Tanzania, there's a company called Yara. Yara is an international company, I think Norwegian fertilizer company. So they went in there and put the farmer at the center. So they're looking at shared value model. And they put the farmer at the center, and they realized why the small-scale farmer never succeeded in rural Africa. Because, first of all, there's no road. So you've done good cultivation, but where are you taking the produce? There was no road. There was no way the fertilizer would get to this person. There's no way this person would get it out. Yet World Bank, for many years, had been building roads in Africa. So what did Yara do? Yara looked around the table and said, we need the guys who do the roads, we need the people who do electricity, we need the farmer, we need the government, and they brought everyone on the table to address this one problem. So in that integrated model, following the shared value kind of thinking, they were able to solve this farmer's problem where his productivity grew, the area became more, the children were healthier, but at the end of the day, what did Yara do? They made money. They continued selling fertilizer. So I liked when he pointed out the shared value model. So when you put models like shared value model at the center of addressing some of these challenges, then it opens up markets and discussions that people were holding in silos. So this model broke the silos. The farmer is happy, the companies are happy, the World Bank has done its road, the government has achieved its objective.
Thank you so much. I believe Joy has got a question for us.
Yeah, I know from a media perspective, you know, they say we have a lot to do. And I come from a background where day in, day out, you probably do a story or two or so many that show you how dark the continent still is. But then again, even with the partnerships that we are seeing currently, either the governments, especially on the African continent, have recently and increasingly recently chosen to work with the East as opposed to any other part of the world. And so this, in a way, is either affecting the decisions that some of these governments are making. And yes, there's a bit of them being old-fashioned, just like you put it, but then there's also the bigger problem of corruption, where for every deal that is made, you know, there's a kickback that is expected. And this, in a way, demoralizes the private sector because they tend to think that, you know, if we're going to go, say, to a country like Ghana, there's something that the governments there are expecting. If we are going to go to a country like Nigeria, which actually needs a lot more investment in terms of renewable energy, the government is not going to be open to a particular investor simply because they're either not willing to give these kickbacks. So there's a 50-50 demoralization issue here, because on one hand, the private sector is getting demoralized, but then on the other hand, the citizens of these specific countries are suffering at the hands of these decisions that are being made by the government. So how do we come from a point of view where at one point we were saying Africa is rising, and there was 100% interest on the African continent in terms of investment, and then this interest trickled down from 100% to maybe 18% or 28%. What are the reasons? Yes, there is corruption, but how do we get the private sector more interested in these projects, while at the same time getting the government to see the point of view that these private investors are trying to put across? I don't know who's going to...
Yes, David.
In a sense, going back to what Chiara said or asked, but also addressing, I think, some of what we've been talking about. I mean, I mentioned in my presentation that the median age in Africa is 19. The average age of leaders in Africa is 62. I think that tells you an awful lot. We're actually in a country that's a huge exception to that, because Abiy Ahmed, of course, is 42, the youngest leader in Africa. But kind of new thinking is clearly going to be part of what drives this. This isn't necessarily going to be new thinking, although I am a believer in, as I've said, in planning and governments and public good. But I'm also a believer in consumer-led demand, and that might be political demand. Your 19-year-old in Africa is increasingly knowledgeable, increasingly hooked up, increasingly aspirational, increasingly aware of the possibilities of technology, of transparency, of politics, of what their politicians are up to, etc. A lot of this will be demanded by these 19-year-olds on the street in an increasingly urban, active Africa. And we've seen this all over the continent. Sometimes it's in political uprisings, like in Sudan, or it might be in demands for changes of law, changes of policy, transparent elections. But we ought not to forget that that 19-year-old is the key to a lot of what we're talking about. And the 62-year-old may not be so much.
But so that's what I'm trying to say, because at the end of it all, you still have 57% of the population living in rural areas. It's 43% who live in urban areas. And while the 43% understand the value of having energy, the 57%, that includes the 19-year-olds who do not know what they want, are possibly out there saying whenever the government wants to give us electricity, they'll give it to us. And so that, in a way, puts across a different statistic when it comes to access to energy. Because on one hand, you have a young population that wants access to all these services, but then you have an uneducated young population that will probably just wait up until they're 62 before, they get this access to electricity.
I mean, there's some truth in that, but I would argue that that's changing very fast. This is the fastest urbanizing society in the world. There's more people being born in cities than in the countryside. And technology here is providing a window into different worlds. I mean, the rise of smartphones, the access to the internet, all of these are on a very fast upward trajectory. And I would caution against looking at the present and extrapolating to the future, because I think the future is changing faster than people might realize.
So, very quickly, because with it, No, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
The conversation is very. Does it work? Yeah. The conversation is very interesting, and everybody was talking about business. Antonello stressed very well with the fact that the business factor is very important, but at the same time, the cultural factor is very important. Here we are, a few hundred miles away from losing. The history of humanity started here, and the history of humanity that we all knows. We sometimes forget that goes together with the history of energy. All the revolutions were done with energy beside. Digital revolution has a strong impact because it goes to democracy, goes to politicians, internet. It talks to the
populism.
People. Eh?
Populism.
Yeah, populism as well. Yeah. But sometimes that's the key for changing. So I agree with David. This continent will go very fast because young generation we talk with every day, they understand much faster than governments, than politicians. And that's a key for arriving to access to all.
Thank you so much. And I believe and I'm sure that all of you really enjoyed the panel, so thank you so much for being here and to, for your participation. And I would like now to ask Michele Bologna, the Head of Communication of Enel Green Power, to take the floor for the final remarks.
Thank you very much, Isabella. I have a quite difficult task now. I'm feeling like Mark Twain, that in a letter that was like 10 pages, and these are all my notes from this discussion, which was extremely fruitful, said to a friend of him, sorry, I didn't have time to write a short letter. And this is how I feel now. So I would just try to make some points, especially for people that are following us at home or during the live stream, and they are not energy experts, so let me remind some very key concepts also for them. So we started with giving the context on the African continent. With David and Antonello, we talked about economic growth, which is very significant here in Africa, population growth, which goes hand in hand with urbanization with pros and cons. Pros like providing services in a much more effective way, but at the same time, we saw in Antonello's presentation, the risk of having a high percentage of people living at the edge of society and without access to energy. So the famous PIN code that David was referring to means a lot more demand. Demand for any kind of services, any kind of products, and of course, access to energy, which is, I think we all agree, the real enabler, the real link among many, many different things. Antonello gave up straight away a solution saying renewables is the solution for this continent because of abundant sources, especially wind and solar now, cheaper, definitely cheaper than other technology nowadays, and this is still to be said, easy to realize, and with a minimum impact. So we started to say, well, how do we make it? What does it take here in Africa to make full exploitation of these sources? And we were discussing briefly about leapfrogging. So can we apply the same kind of, which is a buzzword for this continent, but let's say apply the same kind of examples that we're applying in the telecom sector with mobile phoning, smartphoning now and so on, also to energy. Well, it seems that from a technical perspective, there are not so many constraints. Thanks to Jasper, that off-grid, so mini-grids, off-grid solutions are an important part of that, especially for rural areas. There are ideas, initiatives on how to combine off-grids with grid solution, and definitely to put them together in a virtual tackling another aspect. And Anna was pointing out an important topic, an emerging topic nowadays, which is the nexus. So the link between energy, food, water, and also a lot of other activities. So we think that we have experience from other parts of the world that can be used, but in a part of the discussion, we said also maybe not replicated at full scale in a different context, in different countries like here in Africa. It's part of the solution, but my personal opinion is that we have a huge, enormous playing field which is completely green, also in the sense that, yeah, also for all double senses, of course, double meanings, and there is the chance to break silos, Josefina was saying, to interlink very different solutions, to experiment you know, all the advantages of those solutions, and maybe with a new type of leapfrogging, which combines a lot of different types of example. We talked about rules. We talked about the common framework. It goes back and back always when you talk about business environment to have predictability of rules. And initiatives like scaling solar that was mentioned, the new one that was launched a few days ago called the Renew Africa are actually advocating, aiming exactly at this, finding common rules, common framework to give the right perspective to investors to come and be able to give their, their value. And I'm meaning investors from Europe, from other countries, but especially also local investors. Because entrepreneurship can be fostered and switched on thanks to this virtual circle. As we said in many countries, our friend from Siemens Gamesa was mentioning their it actually helped a lot in also creating a local employment and local entrepreneurship around the big plant. So a lot to do. Maybe from energy transition to energy transformation, as we said, also here in Africa. It was a very interesting discussion. And we are not maybe in full agreement about all the aspects. There were some interesting points made of, but are we sure that this is what African people really want? And my only very simple answer to that, and I think that we all agree that all of them should be able to turn the lights on at some day. Thank you very much to all of you. Let me just mention all these beautiful people once again for our audience. Thanks to David Peeling, Financial Times editor for Africa. Thanks to Antonello Camisecra, our CEO Enel Green Power, Isabella Panizza, Digital Communication Head at Enel. Thanks to Josefina from Rest for Africa. Thanks to Karim Bassier, is correct. Thanks to Joy Doreen from Kenya. Thanks to Jesper Hornberg. Sorry for the pronunciation. It's quite difficult for an Italian to speak Swedish.
The closest thing to Greta that we could bring here.
Exactly. Exactly. Co-founder of GiveWhat's. Thanks to John Lesamir Cortasar from Siemens Gamesa, to Roberto Vigotti, our father, our how can I say it? Grand in the sense, in Italian sense, the grandfather of renewables. Thanks to Guido Talarico, journalist, publisher from Italy. Thanks to Anna Rovzar from Rest for Africa. Thanks to Chiara Cecchini from Italy, US, actually, double. And thanks to all the audience here, and especially to you, which are connected from home and actually had the patience to go through this. We hope a very nice discussion. The next appointment of the Enel Focus On,
yes.
You should say it.
Yes, I can say with you.
Okay.
Because the conversation, of course, doesn't stop.
Exactly.
Because as we saw, it really works. And we're going to be in New York City in September. And we are going to talk about enabling a clean future and the power of electricity.
At the Climate Week in September.
Yes.
Okay.
So stay with us.
Stay tuned, and thanks a lot to everyone.
Thank you.